Good morning, third grade. We are starting another chapter book together, and I am so excited. I loved this book last year, and I can't wait to share it with you. This book is number 4 in the Adventures of the Bailey School Kids series. This is titled Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball, and this is very appropriate for this week since we are celebrating St. Patrick's Day on Wednesday. So this book is by Debbie Dady and Marcia Thornton Jones. Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball. We will be reading 3 chapters each day. As you can see in the table of contents, there are 12 total chapters. They are very short, about 6 to 7 pages per chapter. There are pictures throughout too that you can see and follow along with me. So we will start with chapter 1, The Mean Green Pinching Machine. Melody and Liza met on the playground under the budding oak tree. The girls always met there before school. They were so busy giggling that neither one saw Eddie sneaking up on them. He was wearing a Kelly green t-shirt under his blue jacket and a green baseball cap. Eddie reached around the gnarled tree trunk and pinched Melody as hard as he could. Ow! Screeched Melody. Why'd you do that? You're not wearing green, Eddie said. Everybody knows that if you don't wear green on St. Patrick's Day, you get pinched. And I'm a mean green pinching machine. Well, Melody snapped, for your information, I am wearing green. Where? Eddie asked. Melody pointed to her tennis shoes. Each one was tied with a bright green shoelace. I get to pinch you back, Melody insisted as she reached out to get him. Eddie raced across the playground and barreled into the third grade classroom of Bailey Elementary to have some St. Patrick's Day fun. But first, he glanced around to be sure that Mrs. Jeepers wasn't in the room. His teacher, Mrs. Jeepers, had a long red hair and eyes the color of lime Kool-Aid. She always wore a giant brooch that matched her eyes. Mrs. Jeepers didn't allow any shenanigans. If someone tried to cause trouble, she would flash her green eyes in that student's direction and rub the brooch at her neck. There was something very strange about her. Very strange. Some kids even thought she was a vampire. After all, she was from the Transylvanian Alps in Romania, where Count Dracula had lived. She even wore a bat bracelet, which was definitely not normal for a teacher. The third graders in Mrs. Jeepers' room didn't dare make her mad. Luckily, Mrs. Jeepers was nowhere to be seen. Eddie sneaked up behind Carrie, the teacher's pet. She always got to school early to clean the chalkboards. Just as he had suspected, there wasn't a stitch of green on her. Eddie reached out to pinch her, but he never got the chance. Eddie, I'm surprised to see you so early. Goosebumps ran wild all over Eddie's arms and neck when he heard Mrs. Jeepers speak in her strange accent. Eddie and Carrie both turned to face their teacher. Mrs. Jeepers stood in the door. She wore a purple skirt that touched the tops of her black pointy boots, and her brooch was pinned to the collar of her starched white shirt. She smiled at Eddie with an odd little half smile. I just thought I'd play a leprechaun trick, Eddie stammered. Mrs. Jeepers stopped smiling and she rubbed the brooch at her neck. I will not allow activities having to do with those creatures. She shook her finger at Eddie. Eddie blinked in surprise. But it's just for fun. And besides, there isn't really any such thing as a leprechaun. Wouldn't it be neat if there were leprechauns around here? Carrie giggled. No, Mrs. Jeepers gasped. Where I come from, leprechauns are considered worse than blood-sucking mosquitoes. But why? Carrie asked. They're so cute in pictures. Ah, but the true leprechaun is not as you imagine, Mrs. Jeepers whispered. Their mischievous tricks are a nuisance the world can do without. Eddie wanted to ask more about leprechauns, but the bell rang to start school. As the rest of the class filed in the door, Eddie couldn't help wondering why Mrs. Jeepers didn't like leprechauns. Chapter 2. Eddie Cuts Loose. Eddie slammed his math book shut and looked around the third grade classroom. Kids were bending over their books like they were performing heart surgery. He'd been working hard all morning, too. As a matter of fact, he'd been working hard ever since Mrs. Jeepers came to Bailey Elementary. Eddie scratched his curly red hair and watched the second hand of the clock sweep around. He tapped his pencil as each second passed. Shh, Howie hissed. Eddie stuck out his tongue at the freckled face of his best friend, but he did stop tapping his pencil when Mrs. Jeepers flashed her eyes in his direction. Eddie felt around inside his desk for something to do. He dug through wrinkled scraps of paper stuck to old bubblegum wads, pencils without erasers, a pile of dried glue, broken crayons, dried up markers, old test papers with F's, Howie's missing baseball card, and a pair of scissors. Eddie hooked his fingers onto the scissors. He snipped a few of the F's off his old test papers and stuck them to a wad of bubblegum. It was then that he noticed how one long strand of Liza's hair had fallen out of her ponytail. The long clump was dangling right on Eddie's desk. Eddie glanced up at Mrs. Jeepers. Luckily, she was busy helping Carrie. He grinned wickedly and inched the scissors across his desk. Very slowly, he surrounded the hair with the sharp metal scissors. One snip and the deed would be done. Eddie squeezed like he was pulling the trigger of a gun, but something was wrong. The scissors wouldn't close. Eddie squeezed harder, but it was like they were frozen. It was then that he saw a green flash in the front of the room. Eddie gulped as Mrs. Jeepers rubbed her green brooch at her neck and smiled her odd little half smile. Caught again, Eddie thought to himself as he put away his scissors. He never could have any fun in Mrs. Jeepers' room. But it was almost time for gym. Gym was the one time he could really cut loose. All that basketball dribbling must have turned Coach Ellison's brains to mashed potatoes because he never knew what was going on. Finally, Mrs. Jeepers stood up from her desk. "It is time for physical education," she said in her strange Romanian accent. "Please line up." Every time Mrs. Jeepers spoke, Eddie got goosebumps. Her accent reminded him of a Dracula movie he'd seen. Eddie joined the rest of the class in line. As soon as his teacher turned away, he pinched Liza's chubby arm. "Ow!" Liza screeched. She slapped her hand over her mouth just as Mrs. Jeepers turned around. "Is there something the matter?" Mrs. Jeepers asked Liza. No, ma'am," Liza stuttered. Eddie snickered as they walked down the hallway. "Scaredy cat," he whispered to Liza. Liza did her best to ignore Eddie. Everybody did their best to ignore him, but Eddie was itching for some excitement. By the time the class had reached the bathrooms, he had managed to pinch 3 people, trip 2, and kick another. But that wasn't enough for Eddie. Unfortunately for Howie, the girls' bathroom door was propped open. Eddie acted fast before he missed his chance. He grabbed Howie and pushed him into the girls' bathroom. The girls giggled as Howie stumbled out. "What's wrong with you?" Howie whispered. "Are you trying to get in trouble?" "No," Eddie admitted slyly. "I just want to have a little St. Patrick's Day fun." "You'd better watch out, or Mrs. Jeepers will turn you into bat bait," Howie warned. "Then you'll be sorry." Eddie's face grew pale. One time, he made Mrs. Jeepers so mad, she dragged him out in the hall. The way her green eyes flashed and the warning she hissed made the blood drain from his face. He never admitted to anyone what had happened in the hall, but the thought of it was enough to keep him quiet, at least until he got to the gym. Chapter 3. Mr. Potato Head. In the gym, a very short man wearing a red sweatsuit and green high-top tennis shoes stood beside their gym teacher. The stranger was so short, he only came up to the waistband of Coach Ellison's pea green sweatsuit. The little man made Coach Ellison look like the Jolly Green Giant. "Who's the peanut?" Eddie asked Howie. "He looks like something that fell out of Santa's sleigh." "Yeah," Howie agreed, "and I think he fell on his face." The boys looked at the tiny man's face. He had more lines on it than a watermelon's had seeds. Liza whispered, I bet he's 1,000,000 years old. This guy is definitely a good candidate for a facelift, Melody giggled. Yes, Liza agreed. But he has a nice smile. He reminds me of my grandpa. I bet your grandpa doesn't carry a marble bag. Eddie pointed to a small leather pouch hanging from the stranger's waistband. He knew it was the kind that held marbles. Coach Ellison interrupted them. Boys and girls, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. O'Grady. He's a teacher from Ireland. Top o' the morning, lads and lassies. Mr. O'Grady's eyes darted from face to face. Coach Ellison slapped Mr. O'Grady on the back. We're very lucky to have Mr. O'Grady visiting for a few days. He'll be teaching a lesson on Irish folk dancing. With that, Coach Ellison left for the teacher's lounge. Some of the kids groaned, but not Eddie. This will be great, he whispered to Howie. A brand new teacher to drive Batty. Howie shook his head. Mr. O'Grady looks like he's been around the block a few times. He might not be as easy as Coach Ellison. Eddie laughed. How much trouble could a man the size of Mr. Potato Head be? Just then, Mr. Potato Head started talking with an Irish accent. Children, it's delighting me to be your coach and friend. Mr. O'Grady's voice had a ring to it that sounded like birds singing on a spring morning. But Eddie wasn't bothering to listen. He didn't want to waste precious time listening to a guy who wasn't tall enough to get ice cream out of the freezer. First, Eddie squeaked his tennis shoes on the wooden floor. It sounded like he'd eaten too many beans. Eddie giggled, but no one else seemed to notice. They were too busy listening to the strange sounding shrimp in the red sweatsuit. He was talking about doing a dance. What a sissy thing, Eddie thought. Eddie wasn't the least bit interested, so he turned his attention to Melody. She was listening to Mr. O'Grady like he was giving the answers to tomorrow's math test. Quietly, Eddie crept up behind her and tied her green shoestrings together in a double knot. Then he stood back to watch the action. Now let us be a trying the jig, Mr. O'Grady said. All the third graders moved to their assigned places. Melody moved too, but her feet didn't go along. Kerplunk! Melody fell on the floor with a thud. Oh, she wailed as Mr. O'Grady ran up to her. What has happened to this beautiful lassie? Mr. O'Grady asked. Melody sniffed and pointed to Eddie. He made me fall. Oh, me lucky charms, Mr. O'Grady smiled. I did not think I'd be a-finding an imp so quickly. He's an imp, all right, Melody snarled as she untangled her shoes. He's always causing trouble. Let's not be too hasty to pass judgment on him, Mr. O'Grady said. Sometimes much can be gained by tricks. Eddie felt goosebumps cover his arms and neck. He wasn't used to a teacher being cheerful after one of his pranks. Gee, Howie whispered as Mr. O'Grady helped Melody off the floor. He doesn't get mad very easily. We'll see about that, Eddie snapped. If there's one thing I know, it's how to make teachers mad. But Howie didn't hear Eddie because Mr. O'Grady started the record player. The lilting music of fiddles and flutes filled the gym. Mr. O'Grady put his hands on his hips and started to step to the music. It wasn't long before everybody joined him. Everybody, that is, except Eddie. Tomorrow we will read chapters 4 through 6 of Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball.